It was a peaceful morning when Jackson Cole, a black man with a serious appearance, was on his way to work. Suddenly, two policemen brought names Jenkins and Riley, with cold eyes and a prejudiced attitude, decided to stop Jackson for no apparent reason. They were suspicious and treated him like a criminal just because of his skin color. However, when Jackson's true identity was revealed, the entire police station was filled with shock and amazement. No one could believe the truth standing before their eyes. They had not only made a legal mistake, but were also facing a surprising calculation that Jackson had secretly planned. To discover the full story, leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you love stories like this. The sun had just risen high above the city, illuminating high-rise buildings, creating long shadows falling on the busy streets. The familiar sounds of car horns ringing, mixed with the chatter of passers-by, awakened the whole neighborhood. Everyone is rushing to start a new day. Some are going to work, some are holding hot coffee in their hands, and some are walking their dogs. But in the midst of that noisy crowd, Jackson walked with a strange calmness. He is a man in his 30s, wearing a carefully tailored black suit, his shiny shoes making a light tapping sound on the sidewalk every time he steps. As Jackson slowly walked down the street, a warm smile flickered on his face. He absent-mindedly adjusted the cuffs of his white shirt, exuding a strong, confident aura without effort. It was that calm look that made passers-by look back. After having breakfast at a familiar restaurant, where the staff knew his name and always prepared a special meal for him of medium-cooked eggs, turkey bacon, and some fruit, Jackson headed to his car. A shiny black sedan was parked right in front of the door. Meanwhile, he felt the phone vibrate in his pocket. Jackson pulled out his phone and received a text from his mother, reminding him about tonight's family dinner. He smiled and quickly typed a reply with a firm promise that he wouldn't forget. For him, family is everything, the most peaceful and stable place in this tumultuous life. Just as Jackson was about to unlock the car, he suddenly noticed two police officers coming towards him. Their eyes were fixed on him. It was difficult to guess the thoughts behind them. Jackson didn't recognize them, but for him, meeting new officers on the street wasn't unusual. What was unusual here was the intensity of their gazes, making him feel somewhat uneasy. Jackson grew up with lessons from his father about how to deal with police, especially as a man of color. His father taught him early on to always be calm, respectful, and never give them any reason to make the situation more serious. Those lessons are deeply ingrained in his mind. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers said as they moved closer to Jackson. Jackson stopped, turned to face them, still holding the phone in one hand. "Yes, officer," he replied, his voice calm and polite. He noticed that the name on the policeman's badge was Riley, and the officer standing behind, Jenkins, resting his hands on his belt near the holster. "Let me see your identification," Riley requested. The tone was sharp as if commanding, without any explanation or greeting. Jackson had encountered similar situations, but something about their approach struck him as different. The atmosphere was strangely tense. His self-defense instincts began to arise. "May I ask why, officer?" Jackson kept his voice calm, but also skillfully emphasized his rights. He didn't do anything wrong, and he didn't see any reason for them to ask for his documents. Riley squinted his eyes, smirked, and replied coldly, "Just show us your ID." Jackson stared on Riley for a moment, then slowly put his hand into his coat pocket and took out his wallet. "Okay," he said, "but I still want to know why I was asked to bring it up." As he handed over his identification, Jackson noticed Jenkins step back slightly, preparing himself as if waiting for something to happen. Riley took Jackson's ID, looked at it, but didn't change his expression. "What are you doing in this area?" Riley asked. His tone was nothing short of accusatory. Jackson frowned, a bit confused. "I'm just going to my car. Is there a problem?" Riley ignored the question, continuing to question, "Where are you from?" Jackson replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "I just had breakfast at a nearby restaurant. Is there really a problem?" He squinted at Jackson again, as if looking for something wrong. He then returned Jackson's identification, saying sarcastically, "We've received reports of suspicious activity in this area. You look like the description of the person we're looking for." Jackson's stomach tightened. He knew exactly where this situation would lead. This was an old story he had heard and seen many times before. A black man in a posh neighborhood, dressed smartly, and immediately became a suspect. Even though I'm used to this, it doesn't make the situation any less tense. Jackson kept his voice polite, saying carefully, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. I'm just here to get my car and go to work. But Riley didn't seem to hear. He moved closer to Jackson with a more aggressive attitude. What do you do? Riley asked, her tone almost mocking. Jackson replied bluntly, I'm a lawyer and I have an important meeting in an hour. If it's okay, I'd like to go. Jackson's reaction seemed to catch Riley off guard for a moment. Lawyer? Jenkins, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice full of doubt. Are you sure you're not hiding anything in the car? Nothing illegal, right? Jackson clearly felt the growing tension. He knew full well that situations like this could get out of control. Jackson remained calm, saying, There's nothing illegal in my car. You guys can check it out if you want, but I hope you don't waste any more of your time. I'm just trying to get to work. Riley's eyes were cold as ice. You have no right to decide how we work. Riley growled, Get out of the car now. Jackson hesitated. He knew he did nothing wrong, but the situation was becoming more dangerous. His father's voice echoed in his mind, advising him to stay calm and be wise. Okay, Jackson said, slowly raising his hand, showing that he meant no threat. He gently took a step back from the car, while Riley moved closer, his hand on the gun holster, his eyes sharp. Surprised, Riley grabbed Jackson's hand and twisted it behind his back, making him dizzy with pain. Jackson frowned, trying to control his reaction. Jenkins also rushed forward, pinning Jackson to the ground. This action was so sudden that Jackson had no time to protest. What are you guys doing? Jackson tried to keep his voice calm, but the pain from his shoulder made it difficult for him to stay completely calm. Riley coldly replied, You resisted arrest. Those words rang out like a verdict. In an instant, Jackson realized they had already decided how to treat him from the moment they saw him. And now, in front of a crowd, he was a target of violence and prejudice. An elderly woman named Mrs. Agnes Carter, who lived in an apartment complex across the street, witnessed the scene before her eyes from her balcony, filled with horror. She knew Jackson Cole, a nice man and familiar with the neighborhood, not a troublemaker. What are you doing with him? She shouted, her voice shaking with indignation. He didn't do anything wrong. A young couple walking their dog also stopped and watched the situation curiously. The man in the couple took out his phone and started recording a video. It doesn't make sense, he muttered to his girlfriend. They're arresting him for no reason. Jackson saw the man filming, and for a brief moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this video will help you later, proving the truth of everything. But right now, Jackson could only stand helplessly as two police officers pulled him up, forcing him to stay calm and concentrate. Jackson understands that anything he says now could be used against him. He took a deep breath, looked around at the growing crowd, recording and expressing his disapproval of the officer's behavior. This is not right, shouted a man from across the street. He didn't do anything. But Riley and Jenkins ignored the protests. Their faces cold and determined, they pushed Jackson into the back of the police car, slamming the door. Just before the car rolled away, Jackson turned his head to look through the window. He saw worry, anger, and confusion on the crowd's faces. He took a deep breath and said loudly, his voice echoing through the thin glass, This isn't over yet. Those words hung in the air as the car sped away, leaving the shocked crowd behind. Inside the police station, the atmosphere is cold and completely different from the bustle of the streets outside. Gray walls, bright fluorescent lights, and the noise of police officers busy with their work. Jackson was led through the main doors of the station, his hands still handcuffed behind his back, and Riley and Jenkins flanked him with unreadable expressions on their faces. As they passed through the reception area, several officers looked up, their eyes flickering with surprise. Jackson, a black man, dressed well and looking calm, unlike the suspects they usually see here. Come here, Riley said curtly, guiding Jackson to a table where a tired-looking officer sat behind a computer screen. The officer looked up at Jackson, then looked back at the screen. "What is your name?" the officer asked, fingers poised on the keyboard. "Jackson Cole," Riley answered for him before Jackson could speak. The officer typed Jackson's name into the system. His eyes scanned the screen and then frowned briefly. He didn't say anything but signaled Riley to lead Jackson to the fingerprint station. Riley pushed Jackson forward. Jackson kept quiet, knowing he shouldn't give any reason for the situation to get worse. As his fingerprints were recorded, his mind revolved around thoughts of injustice. He couldn't believe that he was being treated like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. But Jackson knew he had to stay calm and alert. After fingerprinting, Riley and Jenkins led Jackson to a small cell at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a bench along the wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The smell of disinfectant and other unpleasant odors filled the air. They removed his handcuffs and pushed him inside. "Are you comfortable?" Jenkins scoffed, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I'll be here for a while." Jackson sat down on the chair and took a deep breath. He did not respond to their provocation, knowing full well that they only wanted to put pressure on him to react. But he decided he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. As Riley and Jenkins walked out, they exchanged a look that meant they had completed their mission, bringing another troublemaker into the station. But inside Riley, there was something uneasy, an inexplicable feeling about Jackson. His calmness and confidence seemed inconsistent with what they were used to seeing. Stevens, a young officer standing nearby, silently observed everything. "His name is Officer Stevens, and he has only been with the police department for a few months, but is eager to prove his abilities." "Riley," Stevens called out softly, "can I talk to you alone for a moment?" Riley frowned at Stevens, looking annoyed. "What is it?" Stevens looked around, making sure no one was eavesdropping, then leaned closer to Riley. "That guy you just brought inside, Jackson Cole. I think I know who he is." Riley frowned in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Stevens whispered. "I saw him in an article a few weeks ago. He is not just a lawyer, but a famous civil rights lawyer. He has participated in many major human rights cases." Riley's eyes widened briefly, but he tried to hide his surprise. "Are you sure?" Stevens nodded. "I didn't realize it at first, but when I heard the name, I was sure. You should be careful. This could become big trouble for us." 1306. Riley didn't answer right away, feeling an anxiety rising in her heart but trying to suppress it. "I'll handle it," Riley replied, pushing Stevens' hand away. But as he turned away, he couldn't deny the uneasy feeling in his heart. Stevens watched Riley walk away, then picked up the phone, searched for a contact, and sighed before dialing. "Captain," Stevens said quietly, "we have a situation here I think you need to know." In the cell, Jackson sat still, concentrating on thinking. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was a bigger problem. His mind swirled with the idea that he had become a target, but he didn't understand why. He told himself to stay calm and determined to fight for justice, for himself, and for those who have experienced similar situations. An hour passed before there was any sign of change. The door leading into the detention area opened and a woman walked in, looking sharp and authoritative. She was in her late 30s, her eyes were sharp, and her presence made the room quiet. Her name is Lieutenant Kate Thompson, and she was transferred from another division just a few weeks ago. Despite being new, Thompson has made it clear that he is not someone to be taken lightly. Thompson scanned the room, watching the officers busy with their work. She quickly discovered Riley and Jenkins standing at the front desk, quietly chatting to each other. Something in their demeanor caught her attention. As a seasoned officer, she had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, that feeling told her that something was wrong. "Riley, Jenkins," she called and approached them. "What is going on here?" Riley looked up, surprised to see her. "Nothing much, Lieutenant. Just a normal day." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because I heard you brought in a man this morning, a man named Jackson Cole." Riley stiffened a bit, but he quickly regained his composure. "That's right, Lieutenant. We did." "And what is the crime?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. "Resisting arrest," Riley replied, keeping his voice firm. "We have reason to believe he is involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Thompson raised his eyebrows. "Right. Riley nodded in confirmation. Thompson didn't answer immediately. She looked deeply into Riley's eyes, looking for any sign that he was lying. She had dealt with officers like him before, people who believed they were free to bend the rules if it suited them. But Thompson is different. She rose through the ranks by following the rules and expected her team to do the same. "Take me to him," she said at last, her voice leaving no room for argument. Riley hesitated a bit, but then quickly led the way. On the way to the cell, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't as simple as Riley had told them. When they arrived in front of Jackson's cell, she stopped and observed the man inside. He sat still in the chair, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture calm despite the current situation. Something about him caught her attention. "Is this him?" she asked, turning to Riley. "Yes, Lieutenant," Riley confirmed. "Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in." Thompson opened the cell door and entered. Jackson looked up at her with calm and steady eyes. It seemed like nothing could make him flinch. "Mr. Cole," Thompson said, his voice steady, "this is Lieutenant Kate Thompson. I have a few questions to ask you." "Of course, Lieutenant," Jackson replied politely, his voice gentle. "I am willing to cooperate." Thompson nodded, appreciating Jackson's calm demeanor. "I learned that you resisted arrest, leading to your detention. I want to hear your side of the story." Jackson kept his gaze steady. "Lieutenant, I have no objections at all. I complied with all instructions from Officers Riley and Jenkins. I was just walking to my car when they stopped me. When I asked the reason, the situation suddenly escalated. Before I knew what was happening, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting." Thompson listened. Her eyes narrowed as if weighing Jackson's every word. There was something in his calm yet determined tone that made her understand that he was not someone who could only talk. She turned to Riley, who was standing in the corner of the room, trying to keep a neutral expression. "Is it true that he followed your instructions?" Thompson asked, his voice sharp. Riley shifted, looking uncomfortable. "Yes, Lieutenant. He asked us and things got tense. We have a hunch that he is hiding something." Thompson's eyes sharpened. "And what is the specific reason for that hunch?" Riley hesitated a bit, unable to give a convincing reason. "Just a hunch, ma'am." "Premonition?" Thompson repeated incredulously. "A hunch is the basis for an arrest?" Riley was about to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of the waiting area door opening. All eyes turned that way when Officer Stevens walked in, looking a bit confused. He stopped when he saw the group in the cell and realized he had entered a tense situation. "Lieutenant, I need to talk to you," Stevens said quickly, glancing at Jackson and then at Riley. Thompson looked at Riley one more time, then walked out of the cell, closing the door behind him. "What's wrong, Stevens?" she asked, keeping her voice low to ensure the conversation remained private. "Lieutenant," Stevens said, "Jackson Cole is no ordinary lawyer. He is a prominent civil rights attorney and has worked on many major cases. If news of our arrest of him without reason spreads, it will be a disaster." Thompson felt tension rising inside him. She had suspected that things were more complicated than they seemed, but now, knowing about Jackson's true identity made the situation even more serious. "Are you sure?" she asked, looking intently at Stevens. He nodded, handed the phone to her. The screen displayed Jackson's profile. "This is him. If we don't handle it carefully, we will face more than just an internal investigation," Stevens said. Thompson scrolled through the website, his eyes widening as he read about Jackson's accomplishments, not just as a lawyer but as an influential person in the legal community, having taken on corporations, police departments, and government agencies. He is the type of person who can make the entire system pay the price if things are not handled satisfactorily. She looked back at Riley and Jenkins, both looking tense. Thompson knew he needed to act immediately. "Riley, Jenkins," she called, her voice filled with authority. "We need to talk." The two officers exchanged worried looks before following Thompson to a more private area. Once they were inside the room, Thompson looked straight at them with a stern expression. "Do you know who you just arrested? Jackson Cole is not a random man on the street. He is a prominent civil rights attorney who has worked on cases involving police misconduct. If he sues us, things won't be easy." Riley turned pale and stammered. "We don't know. He didn't say he was a lawyer." It doesn't matter, Thompson gritted out. You should have thoroughly investigated before deciding to arrest. Now, we must find a way to handle this situation quickly. As she spoke, noisy sounds from outside the police station began to echo. Thompson stood up, her heart sinking as she realized it was the sound of a crowd. The chants for justice for Jackson and release him grew louder. Stevens, standing nearby, approached. Lieutenant, the community has heard the news. We've had local activists and even some reporters on the scene. If we don't act soon, this could become a full-blown crisis. Thompson knew she was right. She had seen small situations escalate into major crises simply because they were not handled properly. But this time is different. This is not just about defusing a tense situation, but also about protecting the honor of the police force and avoiding a legal and public relations disaster. We need to get through this, Thompson said grimly. Riley, Jenkins, I want you to prepare a full report on this arrest, detailing every step you took and why. It doesn't matter how late it is, do it now. Then she turned to Stevens. Stevens, I need you to figure out how to handle the media so we can control the story before it gets out of hand. As the police officers hurriedly carried out their orders, Thompson clearly felt the weight of the situation weighing on him. She had only been at the station a few weeks and now faced a potential disaster. But she didn't let this ruin her career or her department's reputation. In the cell, Jackson still sat still, listening to the commotion outside. He knew the crowd was growing, and it certainly included his family, community leaders, and activists, who had always stood by his side. A feeling of hope flashed in his heart, but he understood that it was too early to feel secure, because the police were still in control of the situation. Outside the station, the crowd swelled to more than 100 people, holding signs and chanting justice for Jackson. Reporters also arrived, cameras pointed at the scene, ready to record every moment. From the window, Lieutenant Thompson watched the scene, his jaw clenched in frustration. She knew what she had to do, but also understood that with one wrong step, everything could explode. She turned to Stevens, who was standing next to her, looking equally worried. We need to let him go, she said, her voice firm. That's the only way to defuse the situation. Stevens nodded. But how are we going to explain it to the media? They won't accept it easily if we simply release him without reason. Thompson thought for a moment. We will say this was a misunderstanding, that after reviewing the evidence, we found no basis for his arrest and decided to release him. Emphasize that we value justice and fairness. This is not a perfect solution, but it is the best way to calm the crowd and prevent the situation from escalating. Thompson knew this was a difficult step, but she had no other choice. She returned to the detention area determined to resolve the situation. As she passed Riley and Jenkins, frantically typing a report, she stopped. Her stern gaze turned towards them. When this is all over, we'll have a long talk about what happened here, she said coldly. And trust me, it won't be pleasant. Riley swallowed hard, nodding silently. He knew he was in trouble, but could only hope that Thompson could correct their mistake. When Thompson arrived at Jackson's cell, she opened the door herself and walked in, remaining calm. Mr. Jackson, she said in a calm voice, I have looked into the situation, and it is clear that there has been a misunderstanding. You are free to go. Jackson slowly stood up, his eyes cautious. Miss Reed, is that what you guys call this? Thompson's eyes did not waver. Yes, I'm sorry for what happened. This should not have gone this far. Jackson looked straight at her for a moment, his eyes sharp as if looking for signs of deception. Finally, he nodded slightly. I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but you should know that this is not over. Thompson doesn't doubt it. She knew Jackson Cole was not the person to let this happen quietly. But right now, her priority is to get him out of the station safely and calm the situation outside. She escorted him out of the detention area, past tense police officers, each trying to avoid his eyes. When they reached the front door, Thompson stopped and took a deep breath. I will do everything to correct this mistake, she said, looking determined. Jackson silently nodded without replying, then walked out, where the crowd erupted in cheers when they saw him. Cameras flashed, reporters raced to ask questions, but Jackson ignored him and just quietly walked towards his family and friends. As he hugged his loved ones, Thompson watched from the doorway with an unreadable expression on his face. She knew this was just the beginning. Jackson will not let this go easily, and the impact of this event will be lasting. The temporary crisis has been brought under control. The crowd is dispersing, reporters are packing up, and the tense atmosphere in the police station is gradually easing. But Thompson understands that he still has a long way to go to repair the damage that has been done. When Jackson left the station, he knew this was just the beginning of a new war. He was treated unfairly, but he will use that mistake to gain strength. The truth will be revealed, and when that happens, this police department and this town will never be the same. Tension has remained in the police station since Jackson Cole walked through the door. Lieutenant Kate Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over. As she sat in her office and reviewed the reports from Riley and Jenkins, her mind kept wandering to the man they had captured. The way Jackson remained calm, almost expecting chaos, made it impossible for her to stop thinking. She felt there was something deeper in this story. Thompson leaned back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling, amid heavy silence. She knew she had to learn more about Jackson Cole and why his arrest caused such a powerful chain reaction. She couldn't let this story go without an explanation. For the sake of her career and the honor of the police department, she opened her computer and began searching for more information about Jackson. The resulting articles and news clips paint a portrait of a man who was much more than just a lawyer. Jackson Cole was a formidable force among civil rights lawyers who took on some of the country's most powerful organizations. He has won shocking lawsuits, changing the system and the lives of many people. Thompson scrolled through the information, her eyes narrowing as she read about Jackson's most recent lawsuit, a high-profile case against a police department in another city that exposed deep corruption that left scores of officers behind bars, fired, and some faced criminal charges. It was a resounding victory for Jackson and his team, but it also meant he was on the radar of law enforcement. As she continued to research, Thompson discovered a detail that left her cold. Jackson Cole was cooperating in a federal investigation into systemic racism in law enforcement. The investigation has led to federal oversight of several police departments, and many others are also under close scrutiny. Thompson's heart pounded as she realized the profound meaning of this. She quickly called a trusted contact at the FBI who could give her more information without revealing it. The conversation was brief, but just after hanging up the phone, Thompson knew that her suspicions were correct. Jackson Cole was working undercover, gathering evidence for a federal case, one that had potential brought down many high-ranking officials in law enforcement, including those within her own police department. Thompson sat back in her chair, her mind swirling with a startling truth. Jackson wasn't in the wrong place at that moment, but he had become their target at the right time, and the officers who arrested him had gone inside. Love falls into the trap. Thompson knew if this information got out, it would be a scandal of unprecedented proportions. She needed to confront Riley and Jenkins, but first, she had to gather more information. The next hour she spent piecing together every clue about Jackson's work, his connection to the federal investigation. The more she learns, the more she realizes the situation is much more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Finally, Thompson stood up and took a deep breath. She was preparing to face a storm, but she had no other choice. She must protect the honor of the police department and not let the place collapse because of someone else's mistake. As she walked to the work area, she saw Riley and Jenkins with their heads down reviewing reports. They looked up as she approached, sensing the tension in her determined expression. "Lieutenant," Riley greeted cautiously. "Is there something wrong, ma'am?" Thompson crossed her arms, her eyes shining with sharpness. "We need to talk. Right now." The two officers exchanged worried looks before following Thompson into the conference room. The room is cold, with a long table and a few chairs, the kind of room made only for difficult conversations. Riley spoke first, trying to sound normal, but the obvious worry in her voice couldn't be hidden. "What's going on, Lieutenant?" Thompson wasted no time. "Do you two know who Jackson Cole is?" Her sharp question made Riley's eyes widen, and Jenkins stiffened, panic clearly visible. They didn't know who they were dealing with, and now it was too late. "Do you two know what trouble you just caused?" Thompson's voice was cold and dangerous. "Jackson Cole is a civil rights attorney and a federal asset. He is working undercover to collect evidence of corruption in the police, and it is very possible that this department is involved. Riley's face turned pale. We don't know, Lieutenant. He didn't say anything about being a secret agent. It doesn't matter, Thompson said, his voice firm. You two thought he was just another person, right? A colored man that you two can arrest without being held accountable? Jenkins bowed his head, and Riley was confused and speechless. Thompson looked at the two people, his voice filled with determination. You two have put the entire police department and the entire city at great risk. If this investigation breaks out, the consequences will be terrible. Finally, Riley regained her voice. Lieutenant, we were just following procedure. Procedure? Thompson interrupted, her voice rising. What is the procedure that allows two people to arrest a man without a valid reason, treating him like a criminal? Now we are in the midst of a federal investigation that could destroy the entire police department. At that moment, the door opened and Police Chief Frank Daniels walked in, his face red with anger, his eyes full of anger as he looked at the scene before him. Lieutenant Thompson, he said loudly, his voice like thunder. What the hell is going on here? Thompson looked the sheriff straight in the eyes. Sir, we have a serious problem. Jackson Cole is— I know exactly Jackson Cole who is, Daniels interrupted, his voice dripping with hatred. And I know what a mess you've caused for the entire police department. Thompson was briefly surprised, but tried to stay calm. Chief, it's not just me who's responsible. Riley and Jenkins arrested him for no reason, and now we are all paying the price. Daniels turned to Riley and Jenkins with cold eyes. I will deal with this later. But now, we need to focus on damage control. Thompson nodded, trying to stay calm. I started looking into the situation. There is a federal investigation into racism in law enforcement, and it involves federal oversight of local police departments. Jackson Cole is gathering evidence for this investigation. If we don't handle it carefully, everything could be ruined. Daniels looked deeply into Thompson's eyes, tension overwhelming. They all clearly understood that the coming storm would not be just a temporary crisis. Daniel Cole's anger still simmered underneath, but he controlled it little by little, knowing that the next step was more important. Before Thompson could react, there was a knock on the meeting room door. A young officer poked his head in, his expression tense. Lieutenant, someone is here to see you. He said this is urgent. Daniel frowned. Who? The officer quickly responded, a federal agent, named Mark Williams. The room fell silent when that name was uttered. All eyes turned to Daniel and Thompson. Everyone realized that this was the moment they had always feared. Bring him in, Daniel ordered, his voice tense. The young officer nodded and quickly walked out. Just a few seconds later, the door opened again, and Agent Mark Williams entered the room. He was a tall, strong man, with stern eyes and an authoritative demeanor that left the room silent. The dark suit hugged his muscular body tightly, and the silver badge glittered on his side under the meeting room lights. Chief Frank Daniels, Lieutenant Thompson. Williams nodded in greeting, his tone terse, but cold. We need to talk. Daniel straightened his shoulders, trying to maintain control. I'm sure we can explain. But Williams cut him off with a wave of his hand. No need to explain, he said, his voice cold. I understand everything that happened here, and I want to make it clear that this is more serious than you think. A feeling of fear spread through the room as Williams' words fell into silence. Jackson Cole is an important asset in the federal investigation, Williams continued, his voice sharp, his eyes fixed squarely on Daniel. His arrest was a mistake, one that could have far-reaching consequences if not handled properly. Daniel felt like he was pushed into a corner, worry evident on his face. We understand, Agent Williams. We will cooperate fully, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Good, Williams replied, but his voice was firmer. Your cooperation is the only thing that can prevent this situation from escalating further. Thompson held her breath, trying to analyze the situation as Williams' cold gaze swept over her. This is no longer just an individual's problem, but an issue that affects the entire city. Williams turned to Daniel and ordered, the department will have to issue a formal apology to Jackson Cole. When he saw the resistance on Daniel's face, Williams warned, Any hesitation will be met with decisiveness. Daniel clenched his jaw, his face red with anger, but he nodded anyway, showing commitment. After completing his words, Williams quietly left, leaving behind only a dangerous warning. The federal government is watching your every move. Any wrongdoing will not be tolerated. Tolerate. The door closed behind Williams, leaving the room in a heavy silence. Thompson felt the weight of the situation on her shoulders, knowing that the road ahead would be dangerous, but she also knew she had no choice but to face it. Outside, tensions are rising, with news of Jackson Cole's wrongful arrest spreading like wildfire, igniting outrage not only from the community but from the entire city. Protests broke out in front of the police station, with activists and residents calling for justice. Inside, Sheriff Frank Daniels trying to retain some credibility for his ministry, but he knew that an apology alone could not ease the anger that had accumulated over the years. In his office, Daniels sat in his chair, his hands shaking as he grabbed the phone to call the public relations team. "I need a public apology. Prepare to speak to the media this afternoon," he said, his voice low but fierce. The other end of the line responded, "Understood, Chief. We will prepare immediately." Daniel sighed and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Over the years, he had overlooked the excessive actions of officers like Riley and Jenkins, thinking it was just the price to pay to maintain order. But now, those decisions are coming back to haunt him. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lieutenant Kate Thompson entered, her expression stern but determined. "Sheriff," she said, "Jackson Cole waiting outside with the crowd?" Daniel nodded, forcing himself to stand up to face the truth. But before he could leave, Thompson stopped him. "There's something I need to tell you before you go out." Daniel frowned. "What is it, Thompson?" She took a deep breath and said, "I have found evidence of corruption within the department, bribes, cover-ups related to racial discrimination. This is not just about Riley and Jenkins, but is a systemic problem that has been going on for many years." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you sure?" Thompson nodded. "I've begun gathering evidence with the help of Jamal and the federal surveillance team. We need to clean up this mess, but it's going to be a long and arduous journey." Daniel exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "Then we'll do what we have to do. It's time to face the consequences." Thompson agreed. "I'm with you, Sheriff. We need to show the community we're serious about change." Daniel didn't answer, but his eyes said it all. Now, this is no longer a matter of saving face. It's a fight for survival. Under the afternoon sunlight, Police Chief Frank Daniels and Lieutenant Thompson walked out of the office toward the front of the station. As they approached the door, the sounds of an angry crowd rang out, chanting for justice. Daniels, I felt a tension rising in my stomach, but still remained calm, pushed the door open and walked out. The crowd fell silent when they saw him. Cameras flashed continuously. Reporters pushed microphones towards him with a series of questions. Daniels ignored them, focusing on the podium that had been prepared for the press conference. Among the crowd, he saw Malik, an old friend and community activist, standing there with an unpredictable expression. Malik's gaze did Daniels more stress. Daniels cleared his throat, stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it slightly and began to say, "Good afternoon." His voice was calm but tinged with tension. "I want to begin by acknowledging the events that took place today. Your arrest, Jackson Cole, was a serious mistake, something that should not have happened." Daniels stopped for a moment, looked at the crowd with sincere eyes. "I take full responsibility for what happened and want to apologize, Jackson Cole, along with everyone present here." A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Some people expressed doubt, others expressed anger. Daniels, the pent-up pressure of years of doubt and mistrust can be felt. "We recognize this incident is just part of a larger problem," Daniels continued in a dark tone. "A problem that has existed for too long in our department. I pledge that we will correct this immediately." Daniels announced that Officers Riley and Jenkins have been suspended pending an internal investigation. He pledged to work with federal agencies to ensure his department adheres to the highest levels of accountability. The crowd was silent and attentive, but Daniels, you can feel the suspicious eyes and the fatigue from many years of false promises. Daniels paused, searching for the right words to continue, but Malik stepped forward. I appreciate your apology, Daniels, but this is not a matter of empty words. True justice requires action, not public apologies, Malik said, his voice calm but determined. Daniels nodded, giving the microphone to Malik. Malik turned to the crowd, raising his voice. We've heard apologies before, but what we need now is a commitment to lasting change, to hold those in power accountable and create a fair system for everyone. The crowd began to cheer. The applause rang out strongly. Malik's words went straight to their hearts, releasing long, pent-up frustrations. This isn't just about me, Malik continued, his voice deep. This is about everyone who has been unfairly treated by the system. It's about making sure that no one has to suffer like I did, and that justice is not just a word on paper but a fact of life. Malik paused, feeling the enthusiasm in the crowd's eyes, the longing for hope for something better. Justice cannot be achieved overnight, Malik said, his voice quiet but determined. It takes time, effort, and solidarity from all of us. As the applause grew louder, Malik left the podium, determination in his eyes like a fire. He knows that this is just the beginning of a long journey full of difficulties, but also full of hope. From afar, Lieutenant Thompson watched, feeling relieved but also more determined to promote change. She knows the police department has a long journey ahead, but with people like Malik leading the way, she believes things will get better. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Thompson noticed a tall man, dressed in black, still standing at the edge of the crowd. He looked at Malik with an intense, mysterious gaze. Thompson approached. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man turned around, his eyes sharp. "I came here to talk to Malik," he said in a low and calm voice. "I have a message for him." Thompson frowned, feeling something was wrong with this man. "Who are you?" she asked, but he just smiled vaguely and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Thompson felt uneasy, telling herself that this might not be the last time she saw that man. As dusk fell, Thompson knew that the fight for justice still had many challenges, but there was a glimmer of hope in her heart that perhaps everything would finally come to light, starting with the city itself. This street. Important meeting is taking place. Jackson Cole sat at a large table, surrounded by faces full of enthusiasm and determination. Next to him are Maria Hernandez, a high school teacher, and Dr. James Carter, famous professor of sociology. On the other side are activists, community leaders, and legal experts. Together, they discuss the Community Justice Initiative, an ambitious plan to change social injustices at the root. Education is the foundation, Maria spoke up in a decisive voice. If we truly want lasting change, we must start with the youth. I agree, Maria, Dr. Carter replied. But we also cannot ignore the urgent needs of those who are being oppressed and traumatized by the system right now. There must be a more comprehensive approach. Jackson sat quietly listening, his eyes attentively taking in each opinion. He took careful notes, asked questions when needed, and constantly felt the passion and intelligence radiating from the people in the room. This is exactly what he longed for, a collaboration based on the strength of the entire community. The meeting dragged on, and plans began to take clear shape. They agreed to establish a legal aid office to provide free assistance to those who cannot pay, develop a community oversight board to work together with the police department, and implementing educational programs in schools and community centers that teach citizenship and conflict resolution. When the meeting ended, everyone was full of energy and focus. They know that the road ahead is still very long, but today, they took their first steps together. Time passes. The city began to have small but revolutionary changes. The police department, under the leadership of Lieutenant Thompson and a new supervisory board, has implemented new training programs emphasizing de-escalation techniques and cultural empathy. Officers like Stevens, who truly want to improve, are given the opportunity to work directly with community leaders and social workers. The Community Justice Initiative has successfully operated a legal aid clinic that has handled dozens of cases, protecting the rights of those who have been wrongly arrested or suffered police misconduct. Educational programs are beginning to be tested in a few schools, with the goal of expanding across the city. Gradually, the atmosphere of the city also changed. The sense of community cohesion is stronger than ever, with neighborhood watch groups working with police to improve safety without resorting to racial profiling. The community holds regular meetings, creating a platform for frank and open dialogue between residents and local officials. However, this journey has never been easy. There are still tensions, doubts, and unsatisfactory moments. But the difference now is that there are systems in place to address these issues, keep people accountable, and move forward. 6 months after the incident that started it all, Jackson returned to the police station, but this time, he did not come in as a suspect or a victim. He was invited to speak at training sessions for new recruits, sharing his views and helping shape the next generation of officers. When he entered the building, he noticed that the atmosphere had completely changed. The officers greeted him with respect, many even stopping to shake his hand. Lieutenant Thompson met him at the door of the training room, gave him a friendly smile and said, "Thank you for coming, Mr. Cole. I think the words you shared will be extremely valuable to new recruits." Jackson held her hand, feeling the sincerity in her eyes. "I'm happy to be here," he replied, "and please call me Jackson." He entered the room and saw young faces watching attentively. Some people seemed curious, others were a bit cautious. He understood their hesitation, because he represented a change from the traditional way of doing things. But he also saw in their eyes the potential for real change. "Good morning," he began in a calm and steady voice. "I'm Jackson Cole, and I'm here to talk about justice. Not just the kind of justice you swear to uphold, but the kind of justice that goes beyond the badge of honor. A justice that brings peace, respect, and dignity for all." Jackson continues to share his experiences and deep thoughts. The recruits listened, asked insightful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in how to become better officers. At the end of the class, a young female rookie walked up. She looked determined, but no less hesitant. "Mr. Cole, I just wanted to thank you for today's talk. I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference, but lately I've been wondering if I made a mistake. Listening to you, I am reminded of why I am here." Jackson smiled, touched by her sincerity. "What is your name?" "Sarah," she answered, "Sarah Johnson." "Sarah, I'm so glad you're here. This team needs people like you, people who want change, are willing to learn and ask questions. Never lose that spirit." As Sarah walked away, Jackson felt an overwhelming sense of hope. It is people like her who will determine whether the changes they are fighting for can last forever. Late that night, Jackson sat back in his office at the Community Justice Initiative, reviewing case files. The work never stops, but each small victory and each improved life makes the sleepless nights worth it. Suddenly, a knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Maria walked in, her eyes beaming. "Jackson, I just returned from a meeting with the school board. They approved our program for all high schools in the county." Jackson stood up, smiling brightly. "That's great news, Maria. Her efforts have truly paid off." Looking at Maria's radiant face, Jackson felt change was happening, not just protests and speeches, but also concrete actions, creating a better future for his community. Surname. If you love this story, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for joining us on this journey. ****.